had passed, possibly unwilling to let it go. Among the things that were distracting me just then, in the midst of my virginal exploration of what it meant to be a songwriter, was Hindustani classical music. I had heard, or overheard, Indian classical music as a child. A man or woman would be singing on the radio. The singing was instantly up for parody. I never dreamed then that I'd have anything to do with this tradition. My incredulous dismissal is, in its own way, a happy memory, to do with an interlude when I was unconnected to what would consume me a decade later. Dismissal, in fact, is the default response to khayal, the preeminent genre of North Indian classical music. Well before we get to know what khayal is, and vaguely term its strangeness classical music, those who later become acquainted with its extraordinary melodiousness forget that on the initial encounter it had sounded unmelodious. There may be many reasons for this first misprision. When I was growing up, it may have had to do with the fact that all kinds, old and young, talented and less talented, got periodic slots to sing on All India Radio once they'd passed an audition. How did they pass the audition if they didn't sing well? A singer of what are called light classical forms in India would reply, because pure classical music relegates tone and beauty to secondary status, or gives them no status at all, and privileges mastery of grammar. This is not quite true, but has enough truth to explain why people with voices that aren't musical sing khayal with authority. It's related to the Brahminical mode that Indian thinking is often in danger of slipping into. Another reason might be that various forms of classical music pursue tonality to an extremity. Once the ear becomes used to the extremity, it hears beauty. The convergence between extremity and beauty particularly applies to the most sensuous vehicle of melody, the human voice. Whether singing opera or the khayal, the voice, in very different ways, will seem far removed from its normal range and function, encroaching on registers that sound unnatural, so that it might provoke laughter or cause impatience. Classical music might comprise one's heritage, but it also has an air of deep foreignness. Music was one facet of Indian culture that, for instance, the English colonizer simply didn't understand, and didn't care to. But Indian classical music is as incomprehensible to most Indians as it was to the English. One assumes the air of foreignness marks European classical forms too, not only for people from countries outside Europe. As far as alienated Indian responses to Western classical music are concerned, two come randomly to mind. The first is from my mother. She once told me that when she first heard strains of Western classical music, when living in London with my father in the 50s, they made her profoundly sad. Then there's Rabindranath Tagore, in his memory Jiban Smriti, My Reminiscences. Speaking about his time in London between 1878 and 1880, a woman singing reminds him of a horse neighing. The piano is an inferior instrument because it can't execute glissandos. The violin is preferable. Of course, Tagore's remarks arise partly from politics and colonial tension. They mask a shrewd and creative interest in Western music common to many Indian composers. There may be another reason why my aversion to Indian classical music turned into devotion. It has to do with the unpredictability of our lives as readers and writers, listeners and musicians. What's bored us might begin to obsess us. What seemed important might one day lose its interest. You can't be prepared by education, say, for Indian classical music. A change of direction may occur without warning. You find a point of entry you hadn't been looking for. This might also happen with a book. The book could be a canonical one. You read 3 pages and it does nothing for you. A year later, you pick it up and read to the 4th page. It does nothing. One day, you read it determinedly, without pleasure, and, on page 125, you're struck by a phrase or simile. It unlocks the book's language and teaches you how to read it. The point of entry comes unawares. It makes a world or work available which you'd had no time for previously. Until 1977, when I finished school, I wanted